I'm Jerry Bowyer. This is Meeting of Minds podcast, and I'm really looking forward to meeting the mind of my next guest, which I've had the opportunity to meet before in so many extremely insightful books, going back all the way to Wealth and Poverty, and most recently, Gaming AI, and shortly before that, the end of
Life After Google.
Why did I say the Life After Google? Yes.
Yeah, no.
And coming up, Life After Capitalism. He's with the Discovery Institute, which has a conference that they're hosting this November that sounds like something you really need to go to, which is COSM conference, which is you can find out more at COSM.technology, COSM.technology. That's interesting. You have the .technology. We're not stuck with .coms and .orgs.
No, we got .technology, and the name for COSM, which is really it's a technology COSM. Peter Thiel is keynoting it, and we got Bob Metcalf of Metcalf's Law, and Kai-Fu Lee, who has headed Google AI in Silicon Valley, and then now back in China, and he's sort of the mid-Pacific man who has been deeply engaged in bringing Apple and Facebook and all these different companies to China, and now he's in China, but the Chinese economy is changing deeply as we speak, and the whole world economy indeed is at an inflection point where all of systems on which we've relied for so long, the internet, a giant copying machine that has turned out to be a giant hacking machine, and the world monetary system, which has moved in 50 years from essentially a gold standard where money was a measuring stick into a central bank standard where money is a magic wand for politicians to serve their cronies, and where currency trading is the world's biggest industry. Currency trading.
$7 trillion a day.
$7 trillion a day, and that's up more than 30% over 3 years, while the world economy flattened and trade was cut back. And out of the $7 trillion of currency trading, which replaced an infinitesimal portion of that under the gold standard. Essentially, all monies were coordinated by the ultimate value of troy ounce of gold. And
right under the gold standard, it's just different names for golden discs.
That's right.
There's not a lot of uncertainty about that, right? And I think a major point of yours in the scandal of money, and in Life After Google, is that the channel, this is information theory, the channel has to be stable in order for the signal to be heard.
That's right. That's a very, I haven't said it exactly that way, but that's a very concise and eloquent way. The channel has to be stable for the signal to be heard. And so if you have constant manipulation of the channel, and we can make the channel an analogy for the world system, the system of the world. If it's being manipulated by politicians continuously to serve diverse goals, then the actual signal of truth, which the marketplace at its best can propagate, is lost.
So if
in the noise, it becomes lost in the oceans of noise.
For instance, we've had a major spike in commodity prices recently. So what is that? Is that growth because we're ending the COVID coma? Or is that inflation? Or is it both? The signals are all mixed together, right?
So that's in considerable point an effect of a massive campaign of all the governments in the West to escape oil, escape dependency on oil and natural gas, or all the most densely compact energy sources that yield more energy per unit of volume than any other energy sources. And we're trying to leave those behind in order to adopt energy sources like solar and wind, and that in fact
drives
takes
excess demand.
Vastly more land
Right.
per unit of energy. If indeed it can deliver energy as power. Power has to be coherent and consistent and reliable and can't be erratic. So all these systems that are being employed to replace oil and gas and coal and nuclear are all erratic, dependent on the caprice of the wind and the
or a sunny day or a cloudy day, right?
Suns and clouds and so all these forms of power have to be intermediated by vast battery systems that are full of terribly complicated and expensive chemical elements and
toxic
structures.
to boot.
Oh, yeah, well, toxic to boot.
Right. And with a lot of slave labor in the supply chain. I mean, the supply chain for oil is a lot cleaner than the supply chain for cobalt. You go back there a little bit and you're going to find little kids in sub-Saharan Africa getting cancer. And this is our virtue signaling commodity. I mean, it's a morally inverted thing.
Yeah, it is. You're completely right about that.
It's like whited sepulchres. On the outside, it looks so clean, but on the inside is death. All right, so I hadn't thought about that, really, the copper, the way the commodities are being driven by essentially forcing.
I mean, the governments of the world are taking over energy production and turning it into a planned economy. And eventually that will make all energy scarce, as we're seeing premonitions in the Texas crisis, the California crisis. And we're going to see reverberating through the world economy increasing crises of scarcity of energy, which is a totally abundant and ample resource.
Right.
Because it's being converted to socialism. And every time you socialize something, it becomes scarce. We socialized education in America, and now kids can't get educated anymore. The teachers' unions are...
They created a monopoly, and then they went on strike. We're like France. You think about the energy side of things. I hope you don't mind if I riff here a little bit, but the idea of solar energy and renewable energy like biofuels. Yeah. Well, I mean, what you have in the hydrocarbons is eons of renewable energy, right? I mean, year after year, the sun was coming down and plants grew and dinosaurs ate them, and then they died, and then they're stored up in a battery, in giant batteries in the ground for us.
Good analogy, Jerry.
So I mean... sometimes I'm sure they had bad years and maybe an asteroid or something, but over the long run, just like all the gold, sort of accumulated, we have millions and millions of years of accumulated solar energy in the ground. So why in the world would we say, well, only this year's solar energy. We'll only use this, but we'll ignore, maybe 5 or 10 million, maybe billions, right? I don't know how far back the dinosaurs go, but the plants, a lot of this is from
14
plants.
14 billion years of
Earth, of universe development. So we're going to ignore billions of years of buildup of solar energy that's been wonderfully stored for us in the Earth's crust. It's insane. All right, so... So that we were talking about the channel and the signal. So life after Google is, for you, I like the way you describe it. You grabbed this phrase from Neil Stephenson, I think, a system of the world.
That's right.
So the old system of the world, the current system of the world is, it's not Google per se, but there's like a Google system. Could you describe the current system of the world?
Well, the Google system, I think, is... is a working system. It's the prevailing system. It's based on a series of technologies that were launched in Silicon Valley, largely under the guidance of Google and through the employment of Google technologies. And there's cloud computing, there's big data, there's machine learning, there's artificial intelligence, there's robotics, and then there's the whole information domain of biotech. And all these technologies are converging, and they really represent the age we currently live in. And I believe that this could have been a golden age, but governments and universities and around the world have rebelled against the economy, against economic truth, and want to impose their own special interests and which enhance their own particular power. And they did it through climate change first, and a COVID panic second. And I think these were mostly spurious crises. There's scarcely an inkling of truth in the climate change. Climate is always changing, and it's changing rather more slowly than usual these days. From the perspective of eons of...
We're kind of low carbon right now compared to long-term history. They always start their hockey stick charts at just the right place.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the COVID crisis was another just preposterous overreach of government, and socialism always is dependent on some group of elites saying their particular plan, their particular diagnosis of the human condition is so urgent and that it has to eclipse all human desires and contrary interests and creative goals and take over. And that's what socialism is.
If
in 1957 and 58 we underwent the Asian flu.
Right.
And by all significant measures, that's years of life lost in proportion to the population. The Asian flu was 2 or 3 times worse than COVID.
And the society didn't shut down.
And President Eisenhower was president, and he had been through various flu crises in the Army, and he knew there was nothing to do about it, and he did not shut down the U.S. economy. And today, when I bring up the Asian flu of 57 to 58...
No one remembers it.
Nobody remembers it. It was not a significant incident. It was a brief recession, which was ascribed to other forces and in the history books. And so... it was overcome by the creativity of individual people, including a heroic developer of vaccines, and all kinds of things happened. But by relying on the tremendous capabilities of human minds addressing their specific circumstances, and creative in the image of their creator,
Amen.
We can triumph. But it's human hubris where groups of elites imagine that their single perspective has to usurp all the millions of minds of individual human beings. And I discuss this in Gaming AI, which is my
and also in your daily prophecy. A lot of the daily prophecy has been about COVID. And when in the history of the world have leaders quarantined the healthy as opposed to quarantining the sick?
It's
right. I mean, you go back to our Creator. I mean, the Torah, which has a high view of human life, right?
Yeah.
Choose life, right? There are procedures for quarantining, but you quarantine the sick. You don't shut everything down, right? And it's almost like that. This was a test for us that we failed as a people, in that we were willing to so easily give in on fundamental principles. To say, however virulent you think it is, the fixed principles of people are the best managers of their own risk were overridden.
Yeah.
So maybe it's as bad as the Asian flu, maybe not as bad, maybe a little worse. Worse, obviously, than our usual flu. But what does that have to do with our property rights?
I mean, Asian flu, just so people know, nearly 40% of the deaths were young people.
Yes.
I mean, it just was just far worse event by every measure, and seriously, I think this panic is mostly a function of case numbers, which reflect the flaws of the PCR testing that's polymerase chain reaction testing, invented by Kary Mullis. He wrote a whole book about it and how it was misused as a diagnostic tool. The inventor of this technology predicted that it could be misused as a diagnostic tool and create panics beyond any valid medical need, and that's what we are doing. We're mobilizing all the medical resources.
So people with cancer can't get chemo treatments.
That's right.
Right. Cancer is a far more serious problem.
It is.
And there's just so much dodgy use of statistics. Going back to Imperial College, they look at early samples from say Italy or something like that, and then they extrapolate. They look at the death rate, create a ratio, and then extrapolate that over everyone who will ever get the disease when it's going to spread to places. Well, so let me.
And the dreaded Delta variant.
Oh yeah, I know. Well, it sounds scary, doesn't it? Delta. Right.
Nobody's dying from it. They really aren't. Almost nobody. It's an amazingly trivial. It's an actual move of the virus to a less deadly, lethal form.
And it looks like most of the vaccines are good against it anyway.
Oh, sure.
Right.
It's only 2% different, 2 or 3% different genetically, while our immune systems are capable of dealing with 30 to 40% different genetic variants.
We're better designed than we gave ourselves credit
That's
for.
Right.
Our public health officials did not give the creator adequate credit when it comes to the design of our counter-viral internal technologies.
Yeah, right.
It's something just popped into my mind. I'm sorry. I know I do this because I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but things, I try to share some entropy back at you.
Please do.
Well, you look at the you look at the archaeology of Galilee, and you see the cities of Capernaum and Bethsaida, which were plague zones. The plague was malaria, right? And so I was just looking at archaeological reports. You can look at people's bones, and you can look at people's fossilized poop or whatever, and you can find out about parasites. And there's this story of Peter's mother, who's down with a fever, which is almost certainly malaria, right? Because they're in low water, low near the water. And you kind of take a step back and say, what does it say socially about these people? The fishing was a cutting-edge entrepreneurial industry there. So these are entrepreneurial people, and the fishing is good, and you can make a lot of money there, but you're facing a plague, right? So they're frontier people who are ready to go out on Galilee and fish in Galilee, even though there's an elevated risk of plague that actually affected them. And this is where Jesus makes his base of operation. And maybe there's something here about culture and frontier and risk tolerance. They are hidden in the details of the Gospels that maybe we need today.
Yeah, well, Makers and Takers explores many of those fascinating details about the Gospel, the actual historic context of the Gospel message, which lends it greater validity and impact and subtlety and truth.
I mean, if you think about a lot of the church officials I can tell you in the Episcopal Church where I am, the orders from the bishop were very draconian for shutdowns.
Is that right?
Yes, and we did our little workarounds, and our parish never actually shut down. But you want to be like Peter? Well, all right, this is what Peter did. He went to a plague zone and he made a living. And these are the kind of people Jesus hung out with. So there's maybe a little more risk tolerance. All right, so that's you described the old something. Did you want to say something?
Is the Galilee story in that form? I know that the Galilee story is central in your book, but I don't think you
I didn't write about that.
You should incorporate that. That's a fascinating further dimension of it. You captured some of it. I mean, you talked about the entrepreneurial culture of Galilee
and the frontier, but I hadn't looked at the poop archaeology yet. I mean, I'm reminded now of what was your first book about entrepreneurship? The Heroic.
No, the Spirit of Enterprise.
Spirit of Enterprise.
One, but Wealth and Poverty was about entrepreneurship, of course.
Absolutely right. But the economy, you kind of a big economic view and how entrepreneurs drive it. And I think in the beginning of that book, you've got somebody standing in a garbage.
Well, that's Fat Joe, who started this, who built a great empire from garbage technology. He was a garbage collector and created a national chain of garbage collection that became a big stock market star, and that was an amazing from the garbage pickup and shuffling garbage. He created a great entrepreneurial company.
And you have him actually standing in a dumpster, I think, in the beginning, right? And I'm just thinking,
I think a garbage truck container. He was pouring around in it. I can't remember the exact story anymore, but
and I guess I'm thinking the analogy here is in the archaeology of poops, getting into the there are gems. There's wisdom there, so thank you for the call out to my book. Okay, so you've described the system of the world it's kind of worked, but in the panel you were just on, you said yes, but it's in crisis. The internet's in crisis, currencies are in crisis. So the system of the world, this is Neil Howe and the fourth turnings. Technology, right? Social media has no credibility anymore. So let's talk about the next system of the world, which is the life after the Google system.
Well, I believe that this new technology is emerging. It's going to have many setbacks because there have been many conceptual errors made by various entrepreneurs in the cryptocurrency space, so that this is how entrepreneurship works. It sorts out the truth from the dross or from the garbage, and thus builds new systems of the world based on this process of learning. The essence of my information theory of capitalism, information theory of economics, is that wealth is knowledge.
Yes.
That we know we have the same resources, essentially, materially, were available to the Neanderthal in his cave, as Thomas Sowell wrote years ago, as are available to us. The difference between our age and the Stone Age is entirely the accumulation of knowledge. So wealth is essentially knowledge. But if wealth is knowledge, what's economic growth?
Learning.
Learning, yeah, that's right. Economic growth is learning, and it's a specific kind of learning. It's
mainly school learning.
And not mainly school learning, although school learning, if conducted correctly, follows the rules of Popperian advance. That's you have to the propositions to be. Have to be testable. They have to be presented in a form that can be tested and falsified. And so learning systems and learning curves are absolutely the dominant phenomenon in business and capitalism. Every company operates on a learning curve. With every doubling of total units sold, costs drop between 20 and 30%. And these learning curves are the basis of Bain and Company, the Boston, all the big consultancies, McKinsey, they all traffic in learning curves. And they're ubiquitous. Every industry shows them, from lines of software code to trucking miles to insurance policies. It doesn't matter what, you get these learning curves. And that's because that's what growth is.
Right.
It's learning. If it's not really learning, it may be a reproduction of an previous technology, but growth is learning. And then the question becomes how you measure this, and that's the third proposition.
Let me stop you on growth as learning and the learning curve, just to thank you, because Bowyer Research, our little family business, very early on, the learning about the learning curve. Every day we're thinking about this. Every day we're trying to make a decision. Actually, we were just a homeschooling family, and one of our children wanted to learn about economics, and I said, well, instead of just learning theory, let's start to crunch some data together, right? And then that's grown into a business that's involved with managing considerable sums of money. But every day we're saying, well, if we're trying to decide what to do, are we going to learn something? Well, do we have a customer? We might not have a customer yet, but I think we will have a customer if we can learn something. Or maybe we can learn fast enough that we can get cheap enough that we can get a customer. So you've impacted our days, our business, our family. So thank you for that.
After I wrote Wealth and Poverty, which was a global bestseller and was at the heart of the Reagan administration. Reagan quoted it more than any other live book outside the Bible or whatever. But you don't say or whatever with the Bible. But anyway, after I wrote Wealth and Poverty, it was a worldwide bestseller. Bill Bain of Bain and Company called me up and said, this supply-side economics, the fact that lower tax rates lead to more revenues and is all just another learning curve.
Yes.
And he brought me into Bain and Company, and I got instructed in learning curves at the heart of the beast. Bain was a key figure at Boston Consulting Group, who's spun out to pursue the learning curve.
So are we, as we're transitioning from the système de le monde currently, the one that's passing away, with these crises you mentioned, the phrase when I was just listening to your panel, birth pangs came to mind. That there's the old order is sort of having its pains, right? Yeah. But something's being born, or at least we hope it is. So that's involving a lot of learning right now. Probably most of it will be painful learning. Do you agree that most of these aren't going to work? Yeah,
I mean, Bitcoin is in the midst of a big crisis today, with relation to Tether, which is this supposed stable coin that is turning out to be largely a fable coin, and it's a real crisis that's going to cause lots of turbulence. And so and Bitcoin was not correctly designed really to be a money. It's designed to be a speculative asset, really, and because you can't have a cap on money. Money has to expand according to the imaginations and learning projects of entrepreneurs. And if it can't expand, it increases in the demand for money just result in the gyration of the price of the coin, and they think that's a feature, but actually it's a bug.
Yeah. So when you say it's not designed to be money, let me see if I understand this correctly. Satoshi may have intended it to be money, but the code is a design code for a speculative asset.
That's right.
Almost like fine art or something.
Yeah.
Because it artificially limits supply.
Yeah.
And so does this reflect, Nathan Lewis and I talked about this recently. Do you see reflected in Bitcoin and some of the others the false the problems with monetarism as opposed to supply sideism?
Exactly.
Go ahead.
The mistake that Milton Friedman made, and Milton Friedman was one of the great figures I've ever met in my life. He was a titan, and I traveled all over China with him in 1988. It just was a great opportunity. Debated with him constantly all over China, essentially supply side versus monetarism. And I never won a debate with Milton Friedman.
No, very sharp from what I've heard. Yes,
he was preternaturally sharp.
But you were right. But history bore you out, not him.
That's right. I mean,
you lost the debates, but you won history.
He said to the Chinese Communist government, "What you really got to do now is get control of your money supply, so that you can really." Have a stable money that can fund your finance. And I said, let 1 billion flowers bloom. And that was...
A little Mao homage there, right?
And the 1 billion flowers did bloom. And now maybe we're going back to retrenchment now in China. But,
yes.
But at the same time, China is such a big and complex scene that the various cartoon renditions of it in the current media are deceptive.
We've got a political arc towards nationalism, and we just got a disease.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to go back a little, maybe Ice Age tribal here, and not see the subtlety of the whole picture. So let's go back to Bitcoin and the demand for money matters, not just supply.
That's right.
And it's almost like Bitcoin is a real world test of monetarism, which is found wanting. So is there anyone you see in cryptocurrency who's getting this right, where it's expandable according to demand, or is no one caught up with that yet?
Well, I think they're all working it out. I mean, this is still an era of learning, and there are thousands of projects. Ironically, Dogecoin, which was kind of a comedy coin in its origin, actually didn't have any limits to it.
Yes, so it's an improvement.
So it's actually an improvement on Bitcoin.
Good boy.
And
whoever programmed Dogecoin, good boy. There's a good boy.
But at the same time, Dogecoin probably doesn't have the kind of authority and mystique that actual new money should possess. But we're for people to believe in it. And so I believe that we have not found, right now we're in a phase where cryptocurrencies are providing a speculative asset haven against the increasingly debauched world of fiat currencies being wildly manipulated by central banks around the world. So this is a phase of cryptocurrency development, and I believe that from this will arrive a discovery at the real reason why gold was the one money that through the course of history survived as the monetary element. And
this point that you're making about authority is important. I think I can tell you several years ago, I tried to persuade some of my colleagues to take gold assets, because we were invested in gold, physical gold, and digitize them, so you could have digital claims to physical gold.
Yeah, what happened with that? I remember that. That was a good idea.
I thought so, and I think what happened is some of my friends...
You were inventing NFTs.
Precisely.
Non-fungible tokens.
Talking to some of my colleagues who were a little more mainstream, they started reading blogs in the crypto space, and they said, these people are crazy, and they're like trying to overthrow the government, and the whole thing had a kind of a crazy feel to it. And it still does have a bit of a crazy feel to it, right? So it won't get really large assets until it doesn't seem crazy to normal people.
Well, it's got large assets. It's close to $1 trillion of market cap, all these currencies.
Right.
So it's now in a crash, but there will be, I think that new forms will emerge from the rubble, but
they have to be more credible.
But it has to be more credible, and maybe ironically, and I know this is not a popular view in Freedom Fest, so I don't tell Mark Skousen or the various paladins of Freedom Fest that I think these government blockchain-based platforms that China's launching and the U.S. central bank is contemplating, and central banks around the world are trying to figure out ways to use blockchains or hash graph kind of alternatives to blockchains. They resemble blockchains to form new digital money. Will produce advances and will spur the private sector also.
Didn't the moonshots, government programs have produced externalities. Like the internet. I know people tend to exaggerate how much the original.
Yeah, the internet isn't really an example very much, but because there were so many different kinds of networks that were being launched.
Like integrated circuits are coming out of NASA in the moon launches, right?
Well,
is that right? Or am I wrong about that?
Integrated circuits started at Intel, and one of their first markets was for the moon shots for Apollo, but they also were having new uses all over the place. They reproduced rectifiers and all sorts of Boolean functions in ever smaller space. So it was not likely that this technology would have been lost. It was originated ultimately at Bell Labs, and Texas Instruments was pioneering it. It was, and they had the oil industry. They were geophysical.
So they didn't need NASA.
They didn't need NASA. NASA did buy these things, and so.
All right. So I'm wondering.
But there is this tendency, which everybody should be careful about. When you go back and scrutinize the pedigree of any technology in the United States, and you go back into the 1950s, and you're in the sway of this war economy. We were in the Korean War. We were in the coming out of the Second World War. All technologies will find some kind of origin in government spending, because government spending dominated the economy during the war.
Right.
So it's but what you actually find when you scrutinize the history is these technologies don't take off until they escape this government source, and so that's
does the government involvement with blockchain and cryptocurrencies maybe offer the possibility of some more validation?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
That's what I was thinking you were thinking, right? So if governments are doing this, then it's harder to say it's just, it's a bunch of crazy people at Freedom Fest with cowboy hats and are smoking weed or something like that. And not that I saw anyone smoking weed.
That's a good point. And also, it's good, even in communist China, launching a whole new blockchain platform for the country, which everybody knows the Communist Party can ultimately invade if they need to. They aren't going to launch a blockchain that's beyond their manipulation. But blockchain intrinsically provides for unimpeachable identities. And the great gain of blockchain is not anonymity. A real privacy isn't anonymity. It's identity. And what blockchain gives you, every individual, is an unimpeachable identity and record of what they actually transacted. So when the government comes, they have a record of truth. Now, overreaching governments can always send the cops to your door and break it down and seize your computer or seize your children, or this is always possible. But
if it's hard for them to know which door to knock down, and that's what crypto does, which door?
Then they knock down everybody's door.
Yes, they do.
It's crypto. We don't want to. It's not that they will know what door. It's better that they know. It's better that there be a record of truth to which people can repair. At least a record, and a distributed blockchain system, and to the extent that it's really centralized and it won't work. So the whole genius of blockchain is it distributes the sources of consensus and attestation and all the things you need to have a record of unchangeable record of past transactions.
So you would turn down the emphasis on privacy that has been a big selling point for cryptos in the past. That would not be your emphasis.
I think real privacy is identity, is the ability to answer somebody who comes to knock on your door and claim you've embezzled money or avoided taxes or whatever, and you can
prove I'm me and this is mine.
Right, that's right.
Right. See, I see. Although, it is crypto, right? It is encrypted. So
it's encrypted, but it's a transparent record. There are public keys for all the transactions. It's a transparent record. It is the real gain is the establishment of an unimpeachable ground state for the system. These are facts that have been validated and can't be changed. And you can substitute for those facts new facts that are also validated, but you can't change the record of the previous. And that is a gain. Today, the internet is essentially a giant copying machine. It communicates by copying, and nothing is demonstrable on it.
So your point about...
You have to go off the internet to conduct transactions. You have to repair to these...
regular banks and credit cards and things, right? Yeah. So your point about identity versus anonymity, I think kind of fits together with this idea of widespread acceptance versus sort of Wild West. In other words, I think that the early adopters... Silk Road, for example, let's sell drugs on the internet using cryptocurrencies. And that has a kind of a crazy vibe to it, and mom and pop aren't going to, buy into that. But that would emphasize anonymity, but it won't really be.
It didn't work, did it?
No, it didn't. All collapsed. So this won't really work until it's mainstream, and it won't be mainstream as long as it's thought of as a way to hide from the government. It's not a tax revolt strategy. If it's a tax revolt strategy, it's always going to stay fringe. right?
I think so.
Is that? I'm trying to reflect back to you.
No, I think that's true. It's also true that Satoshi did invent a system that allowed attestation of facts and their extension through transactions, and that's what and the reason they work is they're transparent across the whole net. The consensus on the existing ground state that can't be overthrown by any single authority in any single point. You need the whole consensus mechanism to affirm each transaction, each data point, each fact. And that changes the internet, which has been an eminently hackable. The more money we spend on internet security, the more it gets hacked. And that's not an accident.
That's Coasian theorem, right? I mean that you can't protect private property anymore. You have to spend as much on the protection of the private property as the private property is worth, because it converges. They'll steal as long as stealing is cheaper than protecting, right? So this is. Let me kind of take this back to your system of the world idea. And the channel versus information. So tell me if this reflects Gilder's thinking, that a blockchain handled properly is a channel. So we're using it to buy and sell things. The buying and selling of things is real. That's a signal. So, I'm on the interweb and I buy George Gilder's book, his future book, Life After Capitalism, and maybe I hope we have enough blockchain to do it. But whether it is or not, I buy the book. That's a fact. I buy the book because of what I see. So that's real. That's what do you call that? A base state?
A ground state.
Ground state. Okay. And then the blockchain is the channel, which means you're getting away from the idea that AI knows something. We're better at gathering information than the greatest AI system, because our human brains and our optical processing ability, we're able to perceive the world better. Yes, Deep Blue can learn to recognize a cat, but it has to look at 1 billion cats. I've seen maybe 20 cats in my lifetime, but after the first one, I was able to recognize them because we're really good at taking in the world, right? So we're taking information. Go ahead.
Even more than that, I mean, the key insight is, which I really discovered in Gaming AI, this book. I started studying connectomes, and I'd been studying the connectome of the internet for years. That's all the connections of the internet and how they proliferate and how they become more and more complex. And so connectome concept really made sense to me when I encountered it in a book from MIT on the connectome of the human brain. And I knew that, this set of professors, their names elude me, but you can find them in Gaming AI, have been measuring, Tony Stratton helped work out the connectome of the nematode worm, and which is all the connections in the brain of a nematode worm, which is the smallest sort of mental unit that they could find, and they blow it up and figure out what the connectome of the human mind is. And it takes zettabytes, 10 to the 21st power, and that's a number beyond imagination, to map the connections on the human brain. And as Tony Stratton told me, he's worked on this at Brenner's lab in Cambridge in England, which was where the first DNA codes were defined, to Wisconsin, where and he said the more he learned the entire connectome of the nematode worm and knew less about it than he did when he started. And
so there's two things there. I mean, it's really this is a worm, and this is how I think that's the only brain that's been mapped, right?
Yeah, that's fully mapped. Although they've been mapping more and more, and the human brain has been increasingly mapped, and it takes a zettabyte to, essentially a data to map the human brain.
But even after mapping it, I think you're about to say we still don't understand it.
But
right?
But the key, but when I read this zettabyte in the book, I was just really excited. It was an epiphany, because mapping the whole global internet takes about a zettabyte. And so each individual human brain is about as complexly connected as the global internet.
That blew me away in gaming AI. I mean, that's just astonishing.
Yeah, it is an astonishing
One
fact.
human brain is about as much connectivity, as much synaptic as the entire global internet.
That's right.
And what is the power differential?
And billions. I mean, the human brain runs on 10 to 12 watts. And the internet runs on billions of watts everywhere. And so it's the human brain is, technologies succeed to the extent that they learn to serve human minds, distributed human minds. And that's why free economies prevail, is because if you can maximize the power of each of these distributed human minds. The human brain is not consolidated in some data center next to a glacier somewhere. The human brain is distributed all across the planet.
And next to a glacier, because this is another point you make, we don't produce, what are we?
10 to 12 watts, that's gigawatts in these data centers. The chief challenge is to cool them.
Right.
And so they need all kinds of vast fans and cooling technologies, and they're usually created next to waterfalls or glaciers or sources.
Because where there's that much energy consumption, there's that much heat.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
I'm thinking about the movie The Matrix. They had it completely backwards.
Yeah.
The humans were the batteries, the humans were the power source, and the AI was the mind.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely the opposite. We're incredibly efficient in terms of power consumption and much more intelligent than AI.
Yeah.
So, all right. So,
AI isn't strictly speaking intelligent.
Good point.
As we know about the symbols and objects are separate. They got to be interlinked. Charles Sanders Peirce, the great early 20th century Harvard philosopher, mathematician, showed that any system of symbols needs an interpretant in order to connect it to any particular object. Another way of putting it is, the map is not the territory. And Google has a whole world now based on the idea that you refine the maps enough, and the maps essentially become the territory. But then what's the purpose of the map?
Right.
It becomes as complex and computers are entirely symbol systems. And as Kurt Gödel of Gödel Incompleteness Proof, and which said that any logical system, whatever it is, from arithmetic to computer software, whatever it is necessarily dependent on propositions outside itself that it can't prove. And then Alan Turing, who invented the computer architecture, the Turing machine we still use, said that every Turing machine necessarily depends on an oracle outside that can't be reduced to the Turing machine itself.
This is so religious.
Yeah,
I mean, Oracle, you need a prophet from outside the system,
that's
right?
That's right.
And fundamental axia that are accepted, that's faith.
Yeah.
Right? This is Augustine, credo ut intelligam. I believe in order that I can understand.
Yeah.
You have to have certain...
Faith precedes knowledge.
That's it.
Yeah.
Right. And
I said that in Wealth and Poverty. That was the climax of Wealth and Poverty.
The Google system is betting against that. Knowledge, I'm reminded of the Garden of Eden. You don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil first. You eat from the tree of life.
Yeah.
Right? Faith precedes, you get knowledge eventually, but faith precedes knowledge.
That's right.
All right. I'm being signaled. Is there anything? I would love to keep going, but I have to go to my next panel. But I want to make sure that we mention again that we have the COSM conference coming up in November.
November 10th to 12th at Bellevue Hyatt Regency. It's COSM.technology. You can find it, and it's going to be a great conference. We're discussing all the subjects that we've been addressing today.
So all the stuff that we would continue to discuss if we weren't out of time, there's going to be a conference to just lay all that out.
You're going to be there, aren't you, Jerry?
Well, I just learned about it today, and I'm looking to the boss who's sitting next to me.
Okay.
She ultimately is the oracle to which I answer. But thank you so much for being with us today.
It was great. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe and give it a rating on Apple Podcasts, and improve our national conversation by sharing it with some friends.